When the New Testament is read through Jewish eyes, one practice stands out clearly: the Eucharist. The idea of eating Yeshua's body and drinking his blood appears unfamiliar and deeply problematic in light of the Tanakh and Jewish religious tradition. The key question is therefore not whether this is difficult, but how such an idea could arise so early within the Yeshua movement, and how sincere Jewish authors could pass it on. Jewish tradition knows many sacred meals. Bread and wine belong naturally to Shabbat, festivals, and memorial gatherings. They are blessed as gifts from God, but they carry no independent salvific power. Bread remains bread, wine remains wine. It is God who acts, not the elements. Passover, Pesach, is one such memorial meal. Its meaning is clear: remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. It is not a ritual for atonement of sin. There is no collective confession, no purification rite, no reconciliation ceremony. The blood in the Exodus story functions as a sign of protection on the doorposts, never as a sin offering, and never as something to be consumed. Pesach is memory, identity, and story. When Judaism speaks explicitly about atonement for sin, it does so on Yom Kippur. This day alone is devoted to national atonement, with priestly mediation, blood rituals, and purification of the sanctuary. Pesach and Yom Kippur serve entirely different theological purposes, and in Jewish tradition they are not combined. Later Christian theology, however, merges these two frameworks. Yeshua is portrayed both as Passover lamb and as an atoning sacrifice for sin. The Eucharist becomes both memorial meal and offering. Liberation and atonement are fused into a single theological construct. This raises an obvious question. If Yeshua was meant to be understood as the Passover lamb in his final meal, why are the symbols inconsistent? Why is bread used instead of meat? Why is the lamb absent? And why is blood, explicitly forbidden for consumption in the Torah, symbolically moved from altar and doorposts to the communal cup? The timeline sharpens the problem. Paul's letters to the Corinthians were written in the early 50s. This shows that the Eucharist was already practiced before the Gospel of Mark was written. The Gospels do not create the Eucharist, they assume it. Paul himself emphasizes that he received and transmitted an existing tradition. He is not its originator, but one of its earliest witnesses. Within Yeshuan communities, Paul's theology is not treated as normative in the way it later became within Christianity. Yeshua himself remains the primary point of reference. Even so, Paul's letters are historically invaluable. As our earliest sources, they help us understand how early Yeshua-following communities practiced their faith and how theological interpretations began to take shape, even when we do not adopt Paul's conclusions. With this in mind, it becomes easier to understand the Gospel of Mark. Mark did not invent the Eucharist. He inherited an existing communal practice. Writing after the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple, he lived in a time of profound crisis when Jewish life and theology were being reshaped. There was no single authoritative framework, only communities searching for meaning and continuity. Mark therefore writes as a theologian of memory rather than as a stenographer. His concern is not to preserve exact words, but to express significance. He places the familiar words of the communal meal into Yeshua's final gathering with his disciples because that setting gives them their deepest meaning. The language Mark uses, "This is my body, this is my blood," need not have been understood literally by its earliest hearers. In Semitic speech, "this is" often means "this represents." At Passover, Jews say, "This is the bread of affliction," without imagining that the bread becomes suffering itself. Mark can speak symbolically without intending a metaphysical claim. An important detail further clarifies the picture. Paul explicitly instructs believers to abstain from blood. This rule, affirmed in the Jerusalem Agreement, is never suspended. It would be unthinkable for Paul to forbid blood consumption in daily life while introducing it in the central communal meal. This makes a literal interpretation of Eucharistic language highly unlikely in Paul's own understanding. When he speaks of the cup as the new covenant in my blood, he is using covenantal language rooted in the Hebrew Scriptures. The wine remains wine. Blood signifies life given, not a substance to be consumed. Read this way, Paul remains fully consistent as a Jew, and the Eucharist appears as a memorial and covenantal act rather than a violation of Torah. The Gospel of John confirms this indirectly. John knows the Eucharistic tradition but omits the words of institution entirely. Instead, he offers a theological discourse about eating flesh and drinking blood, outside any ritual context, and with full awareness of how shocking the language is. Many listeners leave. This is theology, not liturgical instruction. The argument ultimately rests on one decisive observation. The earliest written source we possess, 1 Corinthians, does not identify the wine as blood. Paul speaks of the cup as the new covenant established in Yeshua's blood. The focus is covenantal, not consumptive. This language fits comfortably within Jewish tradition and aligns fully with Paul's explicit instruction to abstain from blood. In the Gospels, this wording shifts slightly, almost imperceptibly. The emphasis moves from the cup as a covenantal sign to the contents of the cup as blood. It is a small change in language, but one with far-reaching implications, especially in light of the absolute Jewish prohibition against consuming blood. It is precisely here that a later theological layer becomes visible, not through open contradiction, but through subtle reformulation. What Paul presents as a memorial and covenantal act is gradually read in more concrete, even ontological terms. The shift is quiet, but decisive. This does not imply bad faith or ignorance on the part of the Gospel writers. They were sincere Jewish believers working within a living tradition, giving narrative form to practices already present in their communities. Yet their reformulation marks the point at which later theology begins to move beyond the earliest layer. The conclusion, then, is clear. The Eucharist is best understood not as a ritual instituted by Yeshua in violation of Torah, but as a communal practice that became theologically intensified over time. The earliest layer points to remembrance and covenant. The later layers move towards substance and sacrament. And it is in that almost unnoticeable shift from cup to blood that the boundary between Yeshua and later theology can finally be discerned. If you have thoughts, questions, or corrections, you are very welcome to share them in the comments. Thoughtful dialogue helps all of us see more clearly and deepen our understanding. Thank you for listening, and may peace and blessing be with you.